I want to thank you for being at this presentation and apologize that this has to be an audio presentation, as neither I, Joel T. Nadler, or my co-authors, Dr. Laura Boyles and Mallory Maves, were able to make SIOP this year for various reasons. What we're looking at and what we examined was male dominance and additional motivation predicting sexual harassment, and I'm going to get right into what we were thinking and what we were looking for within this study. So just a little bit of background. Sexual harassment is still a barrier for women, and there's a lot of different definitions of sexual harassment. But generally speaking, what is not under question is the negative effects being targeted by sexual harassment has, and also research that has shown there's basically a secondhand effect that witnessing sexual harassments in the workplace also, even if you're not the target, can have negative effects on your satisfaction, your commitment to the organization, and your performance. So in a meta-analytic review in 2003, described that out of 86,000 job incumbents, an average of 58% of women reported potential harassment and 24% reported being physically, sexually harassed in the workplace. So this is an indication of just kind of how common this can be in organizations. And again, this is incorporating two types of sexual harassment, both the quid pro quo, which is usually what we view as kind of traditional sexual harassment, physical sexual harassment, and hostile work environment, basically a sexualized workplace that makes it less pleasant to be in. More recently, similar rates were reported, especially in younger women in 2016, and research continues to find, even up into 2022, that we see similar amounts of self-report of at least being in situations that are potentially harassing. Generally speaking, when we look at both the perpetrators and the targets of sexual harassment, we find that men, males, biological males, are more likely to be the perpetrators, and that women, biological females, are more likely to be the targets of sexual harassment. And that kind of guided this research as well. And when we're talking about sexual harassment being a barrier for women, we also find that it is often one of the actual antecedents to poor career paths within women when we're looking at differences between men and women in their career paths, their success, and their salaries, as well as their promotions. So we were wanting to look at dominance as a potential motivating factor. And again, sexual harassment is often categorized by kind of two factors. One of them, the type of sexual harassment, quid pro quo or hostile work environment. Quid pro quo basically being a demand for sexual favors in exchange for work-related outcomes, even if that is not necessarily directly stated. And rejection or hostile work environment, which is basically not necessarily aimed at the sexual act itself, but creating an unpleasant environment based on sexuality in a workplace. And within these two, quid pro quo and hostile work environment, we generally find that that model is based on the perpetrator's goals of either attraction towards the person they're harassing, quid pro quo, or trying to reject the person they're harassing, hostile work environment. Recent research has found that also men who report engaging in sexual harassment behavior score higher on hostile sexism, self-ascribed masculinity, and social dominance orientation. So there's been a fair amount of research, and more specifically recently, in 2021, examining this factor. And this is also what kind of drove this research, of the idea that if dominance, specifically social dominance orientation, for example, is actually predicting sexual harassment, is dominance in itself a potential motivating factor beyond attraction and rejection. And according to Schultz in 2018, dominant men use sexual harassment as a tool to label women as inferior while attempting to boost their own work status and masculine identity. And this kind of concept or theoretical viewpoint of dominant men and how they're using sexual harassment does not necessarily fit in either the attraction or rejection model, because attraction and rejection is targeting specifically the female that is the target of the hostile work environment of the quid pro sexual harassment. And Schultz is somewhat suggesting, as we are, that potentially some men may be using sexual harassment not to target the woman who is being targeted with the sexual harassment, but the true goal of the perpetrator is to target others in the workplace, that secondhand sexual harassment, if you will, is their actual purpose or goal. So our hypothesis, we propose that sexual harassment, specifically male perpetrators targeting a female target, may have an additional motive of targeting women to show dominance to others, which would be the real target of their behavior. Additionally, those high in social dominance, as well as when the audience is other males, will result in a higher boost in mood when targeting a woman with sexual harassment. Therefore, the following hypothesis directed this study. Men who are higher in social dominance will be more likely to feel positive mood increases when they sexually harass women in the presence of other men. So again, we were trying to actually find evidence that there is supportable evidence that basically suggests that there is this third motivator from a perpetrator's viewpoint of sexual harassment. So our methods, our participants were United States citizens who self-reported as heterosexual working age men. Our age of our sample was 38 years, company tenure averaged 8 years, and we had 186 males take this study. We conducted this study via MTurk, so this was an online study where people across the United States were able to participate. We did do a fair amount of actually checking of the data, and our sample size of 186 was down almost 40% from people that were removed from the study for not completing manipulation checks successfully, not completing attention checks successfully, or in the demographic section provided information that presented information that they were not actually eligible for the study. They initially completed a pre-manipulation measure. They completed a 16-item social dominance ordinance scale. We found a strong alpha for that, and this was Prato's 1994 scale. It was also revised and used by Ho et al. In 2015. Once they completed this measure, they were then contacted a second time to complete the rest of the study. So there was a time gap of generally approximately 1 to 7 days between them filling out the social dominance orientation scale and completing the rest of the study. The scenario that they were exposed to in the study itself was they were randomly assigned to one of 4 written scenarios depicting a woman manager being quote-unquote mildly sexually harassed by a male colleague. This sexual harassment scenario included unwanted brief contact, winking, and complimenting appearance, and then downplaying the target's subtle request to stop such behaviors. Participants were told as they read this scenario, which was approximately 500 words long, to take the perspective and imagine themselves as the male harasser as they read the scenario. And we asked them we used a few techniques of basically cognitive perspective taking to try to get them to kind of both cognitively and emotionally take on the role of the person in the scenario that was doing the sexual harassment. The scenarios varied the presence of an audience, creating 4 additional conditions: all men, all women, mixed gender, or no audience to the harassment. Our post-manipulation measure, so our outcome was participants then completed a 16-item Rosenberg self-esteem measure, alpha of 0.80, and a 10-item brief mood introspection scale, alpha of 0.8. So let's dig into the results. So this is the results for people with lower SDO based on a medium split. We looked at a MANOVA comparing both self-esteem and mood, and in both cases I'm going to present the self-esteem data, but we found very similar patterns in the mood data as well. So across all 4 conditions, all male, all female, mixed audience, and no audience, in the high SDO condition there was a significant multivariate effect, and so was there in the low self-esteem condition. So this is actually the high self-esteem condition. In the high self-esteem condition, you can see that they generally had a better self-esteem and better mood in the control condition, and they had a slightly reduced, actually significantly reduced, in the women in the audience, men in the audience, and mixed audience. There really wasn't a significant difference between these 3 in either condition. So generally speaking, people were in a better mood when there was no audience. In other words, their sexual harassment was done without observation. And we did find differences, lower differences, when there was an audience. And in general, the men in the audience was actually kind of lower and women in the audience was slightly higher, but this was not a significant difference. This does indicate that our manipulation was having an effect on mood, just not necessarily in the pattern that we were hoping or expecting to find to support our initial hypotheses. And likewise, there was the same interaction between SDO and condition. Again, looking at self-esteem and mood, we found fairly similar effects, and this is then the low SDS condition. And again, we find that there is that same impact, that the main significant difference is that they were in a better mood, they had better levels of self-esteem if they had no audience compared to audience, and again, that they typically had a better mood if there were only women in the audience. In other words, we've actually found evidence here, though non-significant, that having men only in the audience actually made them feel worse than if it was women only, which starts to argue against our initial hypotheses at least. We also found that self-esteem by social dominance orientation across the board with self-esteem, that generally those with higher SDO did actually suffer less of an effect on their self-esteem than people with lower social dominance orientation. And again, we found this both in self-esteem and mood. So regardless of the condition they were in, people with a higher SDO were more comfortable after having sexually harassed than those people with a lower SDO, which supports previous research. So discussion. Mild effects were found in established workers using an artificial scenario intervention, so we were actually fairly pleased to find that our relatively artificial intervention was having an effect on the outcome. Generally, men reported worse mood when imagining they had harassed a woman in the presence of any audience. And the study found partial support for the impact of social dominance orientation on self-esteem measures after imagining oneself having just harassed a female coworker, but higher if the audience was only women. However, this effect was less evident in those men with higher social dominance orientation, preferring no audience to their imagined sexual harassment. So we have a fair amount of limitations, obviously. Scenarios were used as a manipulation. Real life would obviously be more generalizable. Self-esteem was measured as a dependent variable, but there could have been other motivating factors influenced by social dominance. There's other ways we could look at this to see if this effect is actually findable. And social dominance was measured in general rather than directly as a motivator of sexual harassment. Future research, we'd like to look at researchers should seek to continue to create more involved situations when measuring behaviors related to sexual harassment. And I do think it's important to examine things that don't necessarily fit our current models of attraction, rejection, quid pro quo versus hostile work environment. Measure additional dependent variables such as the need for social approval or social status. And social dominance could be measured through additional behavioral measures to eliminate common method bias. So our recommendations and implications, if you will, the impact of higher social dominance scores common in those seeking leadership positions and the difference in audience further highlighted the complex challenges women face in moving up into leadership positions. So we did find that those in higher and social dominance scores were actually more comfortable doing or imagining themselves in sexual harassment situations. And we actually found evidence that they were less impacted by a woman audience compared to a male or mixed audience. Though not significant, it was approaching significance. And again, considering the relatively weak manipulation that we did, I think this is worth considering. And again, interventions aimed at reducing sexual harassment need to account for the underlying motives of such behavior to reduce such behaviors more effectively. We're not advocating a focus on the perpetrator's goals, but we do believe that understanding what those goals are can provide information to help us make sure that we can help remove sexual harassment from any kind of behavior within any workplace. So I want to thank you for listening to this presentation, and again, I appreciate your patience for the fact that I was not able to be at this conference in person, and thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the other presentations.